Hey everybody, and thanks for joining us for our new study called Emojis. As the title indicates, we're going to be talking about emotions in this series and how we use our emotions to serve God. They might be good emotions, they might be negative emotions, they might be based on good things, they might be based on bad circumstances. Whatever those feelings and emotions are, we are created by God and given those emotions. So we often look at emotions as good things or bad things, but God has given us all of them to use for His glory. So we want to talk about in this series how we can use our emotions, both good and bad, to be able to serve God. And so we're going to be looking at a group of individuals in the Old Testament who are called prophets, and they faced a lot of different circumstances in their lives, both encouraging and challenging. And we're going to look at how God used their responses to their situations to ultimately serve Him and point other people to God. And so that's what we're going to be looking at in this series. And tonight we're going to start off by talking about joy. We're going to be talking about joy from the book of Lamentations, which we'll get to in just a moment. But I want to set the background of the book of Lamentations for you because, as you might gather, Lamentations is actually not a book about joy. It's a book about hardship and trials and difficulty of one young man who God chose for a particular purpose to preach to the people of Israel. So Israel had been sinning, they had been falling away from God, and so God sent in an army to judge Israel. And the Babylonian army had surrounded Israel with all of their army, and Jeremiah was like, guys, this is not going to end well. You guys need to repent. They didn't listen to Jeremiah. So the Babylonian army came in and they destroyed Jerusalem and they carried off all of the people of Israel into slavery. Now, in this battle, in this siege, thousands and thousands of Israelites died. Jeremiah lost family members. He lost his home. He lost everything that he cared about and he loved. And so Jeremiah, in this time, in this moment, obviously has some pretty strong emotions. He has some pretty strong feelings about what's going on around him. And he writes the book of Lamentations as a kind of like a journal reflection on his feelings about this time in his life and in the life of the nation of Israel. So when we look at the book of Lamentations, that's what we're diving into the middle. That's the emotional experience that we're going to be looking at in the life of Jeremiah for this week. So the book of Lamentations, as I said, it's not something that we probably open our devotions to and read for encouragement because you probably won't find very much. It's kind of depressing. Lamentations literally means crying or mourning over someone who has died. It's not a fun book at all. It's not a book about joy or hope. Most of the people in the book of who study the book of Lamentations describe it as one of the most tragic books in the Bible. And based on Jeremiah's story, that sounds like it's very, very true. So you might be wondering, how in the world are we going to understand and discover joy in light of these terrible circumstances? Well, I just want to walk you through Jeremiah's journey and how Jeremiah processes his emotions and how he finds joy in the midst of a terrible situation. I want you to look at Lamentations 3, verse 20, which says this. He says, I remember them well. I remember them well. What is them? Them is all of those emotions about what had just happened to him. His home being destroyed, all of his childhood memories gone. His family, gone. His people, his friends, everyone around him was either killed or taken away, where he might probably never saw them again. He was carried off into a land that wasn't his and introduced to customs and traditions that were strange and unfamiliar and even wrong. So Jeremiah is looking back at all of those feelings and all those pains, and he's like, yep, I remember them well. And he uses phrases throughout the book of Lamentations like this. He says, I am a man who has seen affliction. He has dragged me from the path and mangled me and left me without hope. I have been deprived of peace. Everything that I hoped for from the Lord is gone. Joy is gone from our hearts, and dancing has turned to mourning. And those are just 5 verses from the book of Lamentations that describe the pain and the emotions that Jeremiah is feeling. And now, while we probably won't experience the same situation that Jeremiah found himself in at this point in time, but we all experience feelings. We all experience emotions that are difficult to process, difficult to explain, difficult to grasp. And so Jeremiah goes on and he describes in verse 20, he says, and because of all this that's going on around me, because of all this bad stuff that I remember, my soul is downcast within me. And we would all say, of course, Jeremiah, of course your soul is downcast. Of course you're upset. Of course you're frustrated. Hey, you should probably even be mad at God for not doing anything about this circumstance to fix it or to stop it from happening. And so Jeremiah is expressing these real and raw emotions. And sometimes when we experience emotions that are difficult and painful, what do we do with them? We just kind of sweep them off to the side. We try and pretend that they don't exist. We try and cover them up. We replace them with something else to try and make it go away. And while it may work for a little while, ultimately those feelings and emotions come back because they're real and they've hurt us deeply. And in those times, we need to do what Jeremiah is going to do. Allow those emotions to come out. Express them. Express them to others. Express them to God. Because that's the only way that we'll be able to work through difficult times, difficult feelings, painful emotions. So as you can imagine, as we've heard from Jeremiah, he's kind of on the brink or the verge of emotional collapse. But then something happens in verse 21 that I want us to look at. Look at verse 21. He says, yet this I call to mind. And because I call this thing to mind, I therefore have hope. He does the same thing that he just did in verse 20, where he said, I remember them, and therefore my soul is downcast. But then in verse 21, he says, yet this I call to mind, and therefore this brings me hope. So he remembers something that pushes his emotions in a certain direction. I wonder if you've ever had a test in school, a big test even, and you've studied for it all weekend, and you get to class on Monday morning, and you're all ready. You're actually maybe even excited because you're ready to take the test because of all the study and all the prep that you've worked so hard to accomplish. So you've done all that. You've done all the prep. You sit down in class and you look at the first question on the test, and you have no idea what the answer is. And so you start to panic. And you're like, oh no, this is not going to be good. And then maybe you say, okay, I'll skip the first question. I'll go to the second question. Maybe the second question will be easier. And you get to the second question, and the second question is harder than the first one. And so panic starts to set in, and you start to experience some fear about what the result of this test might be. And I had that happen to me in seminary, actually. While I was taking Greek, my second exam went very similar to that, where the first test was great. I did very, very well on it. I was confident going into this test. I had studied a lot. And I took the first page of the test, and it was great. Vocab, charts, simple stuff. And then I got to the second page, where we do all of our translating of phrases and verses and sentences and different things like that. And I basically couldn't read the questions. I couldn't read anything in front of me. So as my classmates finished one by one, I was left sitting there for the entire 2-hour class period, basically just staring at my test. And my professor comes in about 15 minutes before the class is over, and he kind of sarcastically says, are you having trouble? And I said, what kind of gave that away? And he came over and he helped talk me through some of the questions and helped bring back to my memory what I had studied. And that's what Jeremiah does in verse 21 when he says that he recalls. There is something that he remembers that is true. Maybe there was someone who came alongside him, like my professor did, who helped him remember certain realities that pushed his emotions towards hope instead of being downcast or sad or upset. And so Jeremiah recalls hope. It gives him hope. How does he have this hope? What did he remember? Despite everything stacked against him, what brought him hope and joy during this difficult time? Look at verse 22. It says, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. Okay, a little positive, but basically what Jeremiah is saying here is, hey guys, all this bad stuff's happening around us, but at least we're not dead. I don't know if that's the most encouraging thing that I've heard this week, but hey, there could be maybe one worse thing in the world right now and we'd be dead. So Jeremiah finds a little positivity here, but he goes on. He says, for God's compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. So Jeremiah, he takes his focus off of all of the negative things swirling around him and he fixes them on God, the one who is faithful. Not just faithful in the past, not just faithful in the future, but he's faithful in that very moment. And that's where Jeremiah finds lasting hope and comfort. Because oftentimes I think many people in this world, including each and every one of us, we are looking for hope. We're looking for joy. We're looking for happiness. We're looking for answers to problems that we see in the world around us. And we look to the government to solve all of the issues in our society and our culture. Or maybe in a personal way, we look towards alcohol or drugs or different things to suppress the feelings inside of us that are painful. Or maybe we're looking for love or a relationship because the other relationships in our lives or in our home are maybe a mess. So we're trying to find happiness in those moments. But ultimately, those things will never bring us lasting hope or joy. Because I believe that they're looking for hope in the wrong places. When we look for hope in our accomplishments or our relationships or being accepted at school or our job to provide us financial stability, we're looking in all the wrong places for joy. Ultimately, Jeremiah says, despite everything that could go wrong around you, we can find joy in life because God gives us grace every single day. And if you don't believe me, believe Jeremiah, because he experienced it. He walked through it. So I want to challenge you in this lesson. How are you looking for and counting the faithfulness of God in your life? Because we kind of just go through our day and take a lot of things for granted. And so I want to challenge you to think about how you can look for and count God's faithfulness. Now, I'm a very tangible and practical person, so I like ways that will physically be able to help me do this every day. And one of those ways is a package of sticky notes and a pen. And I would challenge you maybe to find a package of sticky notes and a pen and put them on your desk, not to remember to feed the fish or take the dog out or whatever, but every time you see God doing something in your life, maybe it's He allowed you to do well on that test, or He allowed you to get through the day, or He allowed you to help or serve someone else. That's God's grace in our lives. Every time you see one of those things in your life, write it down and then take the sticky note off and post it somewhere that you can see it, so that when you come to a day that is not as good as maybe the previous one, you can look back and you can say, you know what? God was faithful yesterday. God gave me grace yesterday. He will give me grace to get through today. And that's where Jeremiah's hope was ultimately found. And that's where I pray that each and every one of your hopes and my hopes will be found, because that's where we find true joy and true hope, because God is faithful and his mercies are new every single morning. Guys, thanks so much for joining us in this lesson this week. If you missed Sunday night, we hope to be able to see you this coming Sunday at 6 o'clock in the youth room as we continue this series and the study in emotions. So we're praying for you this week. We hope you guys have a great rest of the week.